invisible architects. The history of medieval Europe is often told as a sequence of dramatic turning points: the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople, the discovery of the Americas, and the rise of the great European empires. Presented this way, each event appears to begin a new chapter in history, with one civilization or political system replacing another. But the reality was considerably more complicated. Institutions survived the collapse of empires, commercial networks crossed religious boundaries, aristocratic families accumulated power through generations of marriage and inheritance, and financial systems connected kingdoms that were supposedly engaged in religious or political conflict. To understand the emergence of early modern Europe, it is therefore necessary to look beyond individual battles and dynasties and examine the networks that continued operating beneath them. The first of these transformations began with the fragmentation of the Roman world. The Western Roman Empire collapsed politically during the 5th century, but the Roman Empire itself did not simply disappear. In the East, centered on Constantinople, the Roman state continued for another 1,000 years. What modern historians call the Byzantine Empire was known to its own inhabitants as the Roman Empire, and its emperors continued to claim the authority and traditions of Rome. Constantinople remained one of the wealthiest and most strategically important cities in the Mediterranean, connecting Europe and Asia and controlling access to major commercial routes. Yet the political world surrounding it was changing rapidly. The rise of Islam in the 7th century transformed the Mediterranean more profoundly than any single event had done since the fragmentation of the Roman Empire. Arab armies conquered Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and eventually much of the Iberian Peninsula, placing enormous territories that had once belonged to the Roman world under Muslim rule. The Byzantine Empire survived repeated attacks on Constantinople, but its territorial and economic position steadily contracted. Egypt, one of the empire's most important agricultural and tax-producing regions, was lost. Much of North Africa disappeared from Byzantine control, and the Eastern Mediterranean increasingly became a frontier between competing political and religious powers. At the same time, Muslim states developed their own sophisticated commercial and intellectual networks, connecting the Mediterranean to the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. The transformation did not produce a simple division between a Christian Europe and a Muslim world. Trade continued across political and religious boundaries, and merchants frequently operated in places where their governments were rivals. Venice and Genoa, in particular, developed extensive maritime networks that connected Western Europe with Constantinople, the Levant, North Africa, and eventually the wider Mediterranean economy. Byzantine, Muslim, and Western Christian rulers could be enemies on the battlefield while merchants from the same societies negotiated commercial agreements in their ports. The political map was therefore considerably more rigid than the economic world beneath it. This changing Mediterranean environment helped produce the Crusades. Religious motivations were undeniably important. Western European Christians regarded the Holy Land as sacred, and the Byzantine emperor had appealed for military assistance as Byzantine territory came under increasing pressure. Yet the crusading movement developed within a much larger political and economic environment. Kings and nobles saw opportunities for territory and prestige. Merchants saw opportunities to expand commercial influence. Italian maritime republics competed for control of ports and trade, and the papacy sought to strengthen its authority over Western Christendom. The Crusades consequently became more than a series of religious expeditions. They became one of the major mechanisms through which Western Europe became increasingly connected to the Eastern Mediterranean. The emergence of the Knights Templar illustrates this transformation particularly well. Founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the Templars began as a military order associated with protecting pilgrims and defending the Christian states established in the Holy Land. Over the following centuries, however, they developed an international organization with estates, castles, personnel, financial resources, and political relationships spread across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their existence demonstrates that medieval Europe was already capable of creating institutions that operated across political borders. The Crusades are remembered as religious wars between Christianity and Islam. They certainly contained powerful religious dimensions. But they also transformed European commerce, strengthened certain monarchies, enriched merchant republics, created powerful military orders, and brought Western European elites into sustained contact with the wealth and political complexity of the Eastern Mediterranean. The First Crusade succeeded in establishing Crusader states in the Levant, but these states required continuous support, military reinforcements, supplies, and money. This need created opportunities for Italian maritime republics. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa provided naval transport and supplies in exchange for trading privileges in Crusader ports. They established quarters in Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Levantine cities. The Crusades therefore belong to a larger story of Mediterranean integration, not separation. They were not simply an interruption between medieval and modern worlds. They were part of the process that connected them, and within that process, certain institutions repeatedly appear at the intersection of warfare, finance, religion, trade, and political power. The Fourth Crusade provides an even more revealing example of the complexity of these relationships. In 1204, Western European Crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the Eastern Mediterranean. The event is difficult to reconcile with a simple interpretation of the Crusades as a unified Christian struggle against Islam. Christian armies had conquered a Christian capital, and commercial and political interests, particularly those of Venice, played a major role in the expedition. The sack inflicted enormous damage on the Byzantine Empire and contributed to a long-term weakening from which it never fully recovered. Although Byzantine rulers eventually regained Constantinople, the empire that emerged was smaller, poorer, and increasingly vulnerable to the powers surrounding it. The weakening of Byzantium continued for more than 2 centuries. Ottoman power expanded across Anatolia and into southeastern Europe, gradually surrounding the remaining Byzantine territories. By the time Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire was no longer the Mediterranean superpower of antiquity. It was the remnant of a once enormous Roman state surrounded by Ottoman territory. The fall of Constantinople was therefore both a dramatic event and the culmination of a much longer process. It transformed the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it did not suddenly create the commercial and political networks that Europeans would later use to expand beyond the Ottoman world. Those networks had already been developing for centuries. This distinction is important because the conventional story often treats 1453 as a clean dividing line between the medieval and modern worlds. In reality, many of the institutions and families that became influential after the fall of Constantinople had roots extending back into the medieval period. Italian merchants continued trading with the Ottoman Empire after the conquest. Banking families had established relationships with European monarchies. Aristocratic dynasties had been accumulating territory through marriage and inheritance for generations. The fall of Constantinople changed the political environment in which these networks operated, but it did not erase them. Among the dynasties that would eventually dominate this new European order were the Habsburgs. Their rise was not caused by the fall of Constantinople, nor were they suddenly elevated to power in response to the Ottoman conquest. The Habsburg dynasty had been developing its position for centuries through territorial acquisition, marriage, inheritance, diplomacy, and participation in the political institutions of the Holy Roman Empire. Their later expansion illustrates another important feature of medieval and early modern politics. Territory could be accumulated through dynastic relationships as effectively as through conquest. By the 16th century, this strategy had produced an extraordinary concentration of territory under Charles V. Through inheritance, Charles became ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, while Spain's overseas possessions connected his political system to the rapidly expanding Atlantic world. This was not a unified nation-state in the modern sense. It was a collection of territories governed through overlapping dynastic, religious, aristocratic, and financial relationships. Maintaining such a system required cooperation among nobles, bankers, merchants, military commanders, clergy, and local governments. Finance consequently became one of the foundations of Habsburg power. European warfare was enormously expensive, and the Habsburgs were involved in conflicts with France, the Ottoman Empire, Protestant states, and the Dutch rebels. Banking families such as the Fuggers became deeply involved in financing monarchs, while Antwerp developed into one of Europe's great centers of commerce and credit. Later, Genoa's financiers became important creditors of the Spanish monarchy. The Habsburg system, therefore, cannot be understood simply as a Spanish national project. It depended upon a transnational financial and commercial infrastructure extending across Europe. The Habsburgs did not suddenly appear as beneficiaries of Constantinople's fall. Their rise was a medieval dynastic process involving inheritance, marriage, territorial acquisition, and the Holy Roman Empire. The dynasty's origins trace to the 10th century. By the 13th century, they held Austrian territories. Through strategic marriages and inheritances, they accumulated additional lands. By the early 15th century, they were significant players in imperial politics. This matters because it establishes that the Habsburg system had deep roots. When the dynasty eventually claimed the Spanish throne, the imperial title, and vast overseas territories, they were not inventing transnational governance. They were extending techniques developed over centuries of dynastic accumulation. At the same time, the Spanish monarchy was becoming a global empire. The conquest of Granada in 1492 completed the Christian conquest of Muslim Iberia, while Columbus's voyage in the same year opened a new Atlantic connection. Within decades, Spain controlled enormous territories in the Americas. Silver from mines such as Potosi and Zacatecas entered European financial systems and helped support the military ambitions of the Spanish monarchy. The extraction of American wealth required labor systems, administrators, merchants, engineers, soldiers, and financiers, creating connections between European political power and societies thousands of miles away. Yet the expansion of the Spanish Empire was accompanied by an increasing concern with religious uniformity. The Spanish Inquisition became an important instrument of this process, gathering information about religious practices, associations, books, customs, and personal behavior. In this environment, even food could become a marker of identity. What people ate, when they ate it, and which religious customs they followed could provide authorities with evidence about whether an individual was genuinely Christian or suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish or Muslim practices. Religious identity therefore became intertwined with political surveillance and social control. The expulsion of the Moriscos between 1609 and 1614 provides one of the clearest examples of the intersection between religious policy and economic interests. Approximately 300,000 Moriscos were expelled from Spain despite their importance to agriculture and local economies. The official justification centered on religious and security concerns, particularly fears of collaboration with Muslim powers. Yet the expulsion also resulted in the redistribution of Morisco property, particularly in regions such as Valencia and Aragon. Land that had been cultivated by Morisco communities could pass into the hands of other landowners, demonstrating how religious policy could simultaneously produce economic and political consequences. Viewed across several centuries, these events begin to form a larger pattern. The Crusades connected Western Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean. Military orders created organizations that operated across political borders. Venetian and Genoese merchants developed commercial networks that survived changes in sovereignty. The Ottoman conquest redirected rather than eliminated existing trade. Habsburg rulers accumulated territories through dynastic relationships. Bankers financed monarchies across national boundaries. And American silver became part of a global financial system. Political authorities continued to describe these developments in terms of kingdoms, religions, and wars, but the underlying networks were often much more interconnected. Medieval and early modern Europe was filled with networks that crossed the boundaries of religion, kingdom, and geography. Aristocratic families married across political borders. Merchants traded with religious opponents. Bankers financed rival monarchies. Military orders operated internationally. Diplomats negotiated between supposedly hostile civilizations. The same commercial families could have interests in places controlled by different governments. None of this requires a secret council directing history. It demonstrates that power can operate through networks of overlapping interests without possessing a single center. The fall of Constantinople, the Crusades, the rise of the Habsburgs, the Spanish Empire, the Inquisition, and the Atlantic expansion of Europe can therefore be understood not as isolated events but as stages in a much longer transformation. The Roman world fragmented, but its institutions and ideas survived. Islam transformed the Mediterranean but also became part of a wider system of trade and diplomacy. The Crusades created new connections even as they produced enormous violence. Constantinople weakened over centuries before finally falling to the Ottomans. The Habsburgs accumulated territory through dynastic strategy. American silver connected European imperial ambitions to a global economy. Religious institutions became intertwined with increasingly centralized states. The people living through these events did not necessarily see the entire structure. They experienced wars, religious conflicts, dynastic marriages, economic crises, migrations, and imperial conquests as separate events. Only when viewed across centuries do the connections become visible. The real invisible architecture of European history may therefore be less a secret organization than the persistent networks of wealth, family, commerce, religion, and political power that survived the collapse of particular empires and adapted themselves to each new political order. The names changed. The dynasties changed. The empires changed. The institutions changed. But the networks remained capable of reorganizing themselves around new centers of power. Understanding that continuity does not require believing that history was secretly controlled by a single group. It requires recognizing something perhaps more unsettling. Enormous historical changes can emerge from the interaction of many powerful people and institutions whose interests overlap, even when none of them possesses complete control of the system they are helping to create.